The old picture of the Neanderthal is a caricature. We see a hunched, brutish figure, maybe dragging a club. His brow is heavy, his jaw is thick. He grunts and points. He is a dead end on the human family tree, a clumsy failure who was no match for the clever, slender Homo sapiens who swept out of Africa and took over the world. This image is powerful, it's simple, and for over a century, it's how most people, including many scientists, saw them. But that picture is wrong. It's not just a little wrong, it's profoundly wrong. The more we dig, the more we analyze, the more we reconsider the evidence, the more a new picture emerges. This Neanderthal is not a brute. This Neanderthal is a strategist, an engineer, a caregiver, and a survivor. They lived on this planet for hundreds of thousands of years through brutal ice ages and dramatic climate shifts. You don't do that by being stupid. You do it by solving problems, and the problems they faced were incredibly complex. The central question is not whether they could think. Of course they could think. The question is about the quality of that thought. Could they plan for the future? Could they innovate? Could they hold a complex, multi-step process in their minds and execute it? Could they understand their world not just as a place of food and danger, but as a place of social bonds, of meaning? The evidence, once you clear away the old prejudices, points to a clear answer. Yes, they were complex problem solvers. To understand how we know this, we need to look at the world through their eyes, at the challenges they faced, and the ingenious solutions they left behind. First, we have to talk about the brain. For a long time, the argument was simple. We have big brains, so we are smart. Neanderthals had big brains too. In fact, on average, their cranial capacity was slightly larger than ours today. This fact used to be dismissed. Scientists would say it was just because they had bigger bodies, so they needed a bigger brain to run it, like a bigger engine for a bigger truck. But that doesn't quite hold up. Brain tissue is incredibly expensive, biologically speaking. It consumes a huge amount of energy. Evolution doesn't hand out big brains just for show. A large brain has to provide a significant survival advantage to be worth the cost. The shape was different, though. If you look at a modern human skull, it's tall and rounded, like a soccer ball. A Neanderthal skull is long and low, more like a football. This means the internal organization was likely different. Our brains show an expansion in the parietal lobes, areas associated with things like sensory integration and tool use. We also have a larger cerebellum, which is involved in motor control, but also in things like working memory and language processing. Neanderthal brains were larger in the occipital lobe, the part at the back that processes vision. What does this mean? It might mean their way of thinking was different. Perhaps they had a more visually oriented intelligence, a deep intuitive understanding of their landscape and the animals within it. Perhaps our intelligence leaned more towards social networking and symbolic communication. It's not about one being better than the other, but about being differently specialized. Their brain was the hardware that evolved to solve Neanderthal problems in a Neanderthal world. It was a powerful tool, custom built for the challenges of Ice Age Europe and Asia. The idea that their brain was just a bigger, dumber version of ours is gone. It was a different kind of brilliant. The most direct evidence of their minds is in their hands. The tools they made tell a story of foresight, planning, and skill. For a long time, Neanderthal technology, known as the Mousterian industry, was seen as static. People thought they made the same boring hand axes for 100,000 years. Again, this was a misunderstanding. Their primary technique was a revolutionary process called the Levallois technique. This was not just about banging two rocks together until you got a sharp edge. The Levallois method is like prehistoric 3D printing, but in reverse. It's a process of subtraction, of seeing the tool inside the stone before you ever make it. A Neanderthal would start with a large cobble of flint, the core. Then, they would meticulously chip away at the edges, shaping the core from the top, bottom, and sides. They weren't making a tool yet, they were preparing the platform. Every chip was a calculated step in a long sequence. The goal was to prepare the core in such a way that a single, final, decisive strike would pop off a perfectly shaped flake. This flake would be the final product, a sharp, standardized spear point or scraper, ready to use with little to no modification. Think about the mental steps involved. First, you have to find the right kind of stone. It needs to be free of cracks and impurities. Then, you need to hold a mental template of the final flake in your mind. You have to visualize it. Then, you have to plan and execute a series of dozens of preparatory strikes, each one shaping the core towards that final goal. You have to understand fracture dynamics, how force travels through stone. A mistake at any point in the process ruins the core, and you have to start over. This is not simple. It's an algorithm, it's a concept. It requires abstract thought, fine motor control, and the ability to follow a complex pre-planned sequence. And it had to be taught. A young Neanderthal couldn't learn this just by watching. It would require demonstration, correction, and practice. It's a tradition of knowledge passed down through generations. But they went even further. They were not just stonemasons, they were chemists. One of the most stunning discoveries is that Neanderthals created their own synthetic material, birch bark tar. This was the world's first superglue. They used it to attach stone points to wooden spears, a process called hafting. This makes a spear far more effective and durable than just a sharpened stick. But making birch bark tar is not an accident. You can't just burn some bark and get glue. The process is surprisingly complex. You have to heat birch bark to a temperature between 340 and 400 degrees Celsius. And you have to do it in an oxygen-deprived environment. If there's too much oxygen, the bark just burns to ash. If the temperature is too low, the tar doesn't form. If it's too high, it burns away. To achieve this, Neanderthals would have had to dig a pit, place rolls of birch bark inside, cover it with stones and soil to seal out the air, and then build a controlled fire on top. They had to manage the temperature and time carefully. After several hours, a sticky black tar would have condensed on the cooler surfaces at the bottom of the pit. This is a multi-stage technological process. It requires understanding of materials, fire control, and a concept of chemical transformation. You can't stumble upon this. It has to be figured out, refined, and taught. It is a solution to a complex engineering problem. How do you securely join two different materials, stone and wood, to create a more effective composite tool? The existence of birch bark tar is one of the strongest arguments for the sophisticated cognitive abilities of Neanderthals. It shows they could experiment, innovate, and master a complex procedure that wouldn't be rediscovered by modern humans for thousands of years. These advanced tools were not for show. They were for solving the ultimate problem: getting food. Neanderthals were apex predators in a very dangerous world. They didn't just scavenge leftovers. Hunted some of the largest and most fearsome animals of the Ice Age mammoths, woolly rhinos, giant cave bears, and massive wild cattle called aurochs. Hunting a rabbit with a stick is one thing. Hunting a 6-ton mammoth with a stone-tipped spear is a problem of an entirely different order of magnitude. You cannot do this alone. It requires a group, and a group requires a plan. Fossil evidence from numerous sites shows us what they were eating. We find piles of mammoth bones with Neanderthal tools mixed in. Isotope analysis of their skeletons shows they had a diet extremely high in meat, specifically from large terrestrial herbivores. They're at the top of the food chain, so how did they do it? They had to understand animal behavior. They knew the migration routes, they knew where their herds would be at certain times of the year. They likely used the landscape to their advantage, driving animals into dead-end ravines, bogs, or off cliffs. This requires cooperation and communication. Imagine a hunt. A group of Neanderthals, maybe 10 or 15 of them, men and women, find a woolly rhino. They don't just charge at it, that's suicide. They would have to coordinate. Some might act as drivers, using fire or noise to spook the animal and steer it in a specific direction. Others would lie in wait at a pre-chosen spot. They would need a leader to direct the action, and everyone would need to understand their role. They would need signals, a way to communicate intent and react to the animal's movements in real time. Then, at the right moment, the hunters with spears would have to get close. These were not throwing spears. Their weapons were heavy, designed for thrusting. That means they had to get within arm's length of a terrified, angry, multi-ton animal armed with a giant horn. It required immense courage, but also immense calculation of risk. After the kill, the problem-solving continued. A mammoth is a mountain of meat, fat, and bone. You can't just drag it home. They had to butcher it on site. This was a coordinated effort, using their specialized stone tools to cut through the thick hide, strip the meat, and break the bones to get at the nutritious marrow. This was a communal project. The success of the hunt fed the entire group, from the youngest child to the oldest elder. The hunt was a complex social and intellectual puzzle that they solved again and again for millennia. Their intelligence wasn't just about the practicalities of tools and food, it extended into the social and emotional realm. Perhaps the most human thing we see in the Neanderthal record is evidence of compassion. For a long time, the rule of the wild was seen as survival of the fittest. If you were weak or injured, you were left behind. The Neanderthal fossil record tells a different story. There is the famous case of the old man of La Chapelle aux Saints in France. This individual was old for a Neanderthal, maybe around 40. He suffered from severe crippling arthritis in his spine. He had a fractured hip, and he had lost most of his teeth. He would have been in constant pain, unable to walk properly, and unable to chew tough meat. He could not have hunted or kept up with the group on his own, yet he lived for years with these ailments. The only way that is possible is if his group cared for him. They must have protected him from predators. They must have shared their food with him, perhaps even chewing it for him. This was not a purely rational act. It was an act of empathy. It shows a social structure where the group's bonds were strong enough to support its most vulnerable members. An even more striking example comes from Shanidar Cave in Iraq. One individual, known as Shanidar I, had a staggering list of injuries. A crushing blow to the side of his head when he was young had likely blinded him in one eye and damaged his brain. His right arm was withered and had been amputated above the elbow. He had a severe leg injury that would have made him walk with a painful limp. He was also partially deaf. He was by any measure severely disabled, and yet he lived to be around 40 or 50 years old. He was an invalid who was kept alive by his family for decades. This is not the behavior of a brutish, unfeeling creature. This is the behavior of a community with a deep sense of social responsibility. Solving the problem of, what do we do with our injured friend? With the answer, we care for him, as a deeply complex and human solution. This sense of community may have extended even to ideas about life and death. Did Neanderthals bury their dead? This is one of the most hotly debated topics in paleoanthropology. For a long time, many skeletons found in caves were assumed to be intentional burials. La Chapelle aux Saints and Shanidar are classic examples. The skeletons were found in pits, sometimes in a flexed fetal position. Skeptics argue that these could be natural occurrences. A person could die in a cave, and the body could be naturally covered by sediment. However, the evidence for intentional burial is growing stronger. At sites like La Forêt in France, a whole group of Neanderthals, adults, children, and infants were found buried. At Shanidar, one burial famously contained clumps of pollen. The excavator, Ralph Selecki, suggested this meant the body had been laid to rest on a bed of flowers. While this flower burial interpretation is now questioned, the pollen could have been brought in by burrowing rodents. The simple fact of placing a body in a dug grave is itself a profound act. Why bury the dead? It's not a practical survival strategy. It takes time and energy. It suggests something more. It can be a simple matter of hygiene, of getting a decaying body out of the living space. But it could also be an act of grief, of respect. It shows that the dead individual still had a place in the minds of the living. It's a way of dealing with the emotional and social problem of loss. It's the beginning of ritual. Whether they had a concept of an afterlife is impossible to know, but the act of burial itself hints at a mind capable of abstract thought, of contemplating something beyond the immediate physical world. The ultimate test of abstract thought is symbolism. This is the ability to use one thing to represent another. It's the foundation of art, language, and identity. For decades, this was seen as the one thing that truly separated us from them. We had cave paintings, carved figurines, and personal ornaments. Neanderthals, it was thought, had none of this. Their world was purely functional. This, too, is changing. The evidence is more subtle than the grand cave art of Lascaux, but it's there. Neanderthals consistently collected materials with no obvious practical use. They gathered ochre, a natural mineral pigment. They used it in shades of red, yellow, and black. We find lumps of it at their sites, some with scrape marks on them. What were they using it for? They might have used it for practical tasks like treating animal hides, but it's also very possible they were using it on their own bodies as paint. Body adornment is a universal human trait, a way of signaling identity, status, or group affiliation. They also collected other strange objects. They picked up unusual fossils and crystals. At one site, they collected eagle talons. The talons show cut marks and polishing, suggesting they were worn as pendants or parts of a necklace. An eagle talon is not a tool. It doesn't help you get food. Its value is purely symbolic. It might represent strength or a connection to the sky or a personal achievement. Whatever it meant, it was an object of meaning. The most dramatic and still controversial piece of evidence for Neanderthal symbolism lies deep inside Bruniquel Cave in France. Over 1,000 feet from the entrance, in total darkness, someone broke off hundreds of stalagmites from the cave floor. They then arranged them into 2 large rings and several smaller piles. They built fires on these structures, leaving behind burned bones. This was not a home. It was too deep, too dark. This was a construction project. It required a group of people, a plan, and a reliable light source like torches. and it was done 176,000 years ago. This predates the arrival of modern humans in Europe by over 100,000 years. It was the work of Neanderthals. We have no idea what it was for. Was it a ritual space? A meeting place? Some kind of shrine? We will probably never know, but we know what it wasn't. It wasn't simple survival. It was a complex, organized activity driven by an abstract purpose. It is one of the most powerful pieces of evidence that Neanderthals had a rich inner world, a world of symbol and meaning that we are only just beginning to glimpse. So if they were so smart, so capable, what happened to them? Why are we here and they are not? This is the final complex problem. The traditional answer was that we arrived, and with our superior brains, tools, and social organization, we simply outcompeted them. We were the better problem solvers. There might be some truth to this. Around 40,000 years ago, when modern humans were spreading across Europe, we see a shift in technology. The modern human toolkit, the Aurignacian, was more diverse. It included long, slender blades, as well as tools made from bone, antler, and ivory. They made eyed needles for sewing fitted clothing, a crucial advantage in the cold. They made spear throwers, or atlatls, which allowed them to hurl projectiles from a safe distance. This was a significant technological leap. Our social networks may also have been larger and more widespread. This would have allowed for the exchange of goods and information over a wider area, creating a buffer against local resource shortages. And we were certainly prolific symbol users, creating stunning art and music. This shared culture might have helped create stronger bonds between larger groups of people. But the story is likely more complicated than a simple replacement. The end of the Neanderthals was probably a slow process, a result of many factors. The climate was highly unstable during their final millennia, which would have put immense pressure on their populations. Their population density was always low, and they may have been living in small, isolated groups. When modern humans arrived, they didn't face a vast, unified Neanderthal nation. They encountered scattered bands of people, and we did not just fight them. We met them, we interacted with them. The proof is in our DNA. Most people today with ancestry outside of Africa carry between 1% and 2% Neanderthal DNA. This means that when our ancestors met Neanderthals, they didn't just see them as competitors or as animals. They saw them as partners, they had children together, and those children were raised in modern human societies, passing those genes down to us. But perhaps Neanderthals didn't so much go extinct as become absorbed. Their way of life, their technology, their world came to an end. But a small part of them lives on in us. So, could Neanderthals solve complex problems? The evidence is overwhelming. They solved the engineering problem of creating sophisticated composite tools. They solved the logistical and strategic problem of hunting massive, dangerous animals. They solved the social problem of caring for their weak and injured, showing a capacity for empathy and community. And they were beginning to solve the abstract problems of meaning and death, with burials and the use of symbols. Well, they were not a failed experiment. They were a stunning success. They thrived for 300,000 years, a period more than 10 times longer than our own species has had recorded history. They were not witless brutes. They were a different kind of human, with a different kind of mind, adapted to a different world. Their solutions were not always our solutions, but they were effective. They were intelligent. They were human. The caricature of the club-wielding caveman is finally being replaced by the reality, a resourceful, resilient, and complex cousin whose story is inextricably linked with our own. Looking at them is like looking at a version of humanity that took a different path. It's a humbling reminder that there has been more than one way to be human on this planet.